Sha Hualing didn't know why Luo Binghe had become so furious, and she struggled while frantically scanning the area through tear-blurred eyes, trying to figure out exactly what had brought on this punishment. When her gaze swept over Shen Qingqiu's face, she suddenly looked like she had seen a ghost.
My lord, forgive me. This subordinate knows her mistake, but this subordinate swears that it was a complete coincidence,
she said in a terrified voice.
My lord, forgive me. I honestly didn't do it this time.
Inside, Sha Hualing was bitterly grousing non-stop. You see, she had a rap sheet. Ever since joining Luo Binghe's forces, she had watched Luo Binghe spend all his time gazing at Shen Qingqiu's corpse and managed to more or less guess a couple of unspeakable things. Thinking herself clever, she'd found a person whose face was about similar to Shen Qingqiu's by about 5 parts of 10, then asked a capable demon to perform some minor modifications to make the fake perfectly match the original. One could have called it a work of otherworldly quality. Afterward, she'd sent the counterfeit to Luo Binghe, and the result? Not only had it failed to make Luo Binghe happy, it had sent him into a terrible rage instead. He'd nearly wiped out the entirety of Chiyun Cave in a horrible massacre. Sha Hualing would never forget about that, nor did she wish to see that expression of Luo Binghe's again. From then on, she was careful, not daring to touch on anything even slightly related to the subject. Who could have known that the vessel she had settled on this time would also coincidentally share some similarities with that fucking Shen Qingqiu's eyes and brows? This was definitely another violation of Luo Binghe's major taboo. I seem to have previously warned you not to try anything with this face, Luo Binghe said. Strung up in mid-air, Sha Hualing's face was flushed red from asphyxiation. After a stream of choking noises, she said, pained,
This time, this subordinate truly didn't do it on purpose.
Though Shen Qingqiu didn't know the ins and outs of the situation here, he'd pretty much guessed that it was related to this face of his. He shut his mouth, fretting inside. He'd already been dead for 5 years, and just looking at someone with a similar appearance still made Luo Binghe profoundly angry. It looked like he'd really left some severe scars on Luo Binghe's psyche. Suddenly, a sharp pain assaulted Shen Qingqiu's abdomen, like tens of thousands of steel needles were piercing through his organs. This time, no level of bountiful spiritual energy would help him. His vision darkened, and he coughed up a mouthful of blood, red with a hint of black. The air pressure around Luo Binghe had dropped to extreme lows, and his gaze was that of a person looking at something dead. At his waist, Xing Mo sword trembled in excitement while humming unceasingly, as if about to exit its sheath. His hand pressed down on the hilt, and an all-consuming red welled from the depths of his eyes. Shen Qingqiu wiped at the blood by his mouth, a little stupefied by the sight. Logically speaking, after starting the Demon Realm arc, Luo Binghe should have rewired himself into a relatively stable state. Sucking someone dry every month should only have consolidated him further. So why did he have the feeling that Luo Binghe's internal balance had instead worsened? It was even more turbulent than when Shen Qingqiu had incidentally helped suppress it after self-detonating. As Sha Hualing was hoisted increasingly higher, she saw Shen Qingqiu cough up blood, and she knew that Luo Binghe had the intent to kill, that he was currently manipulating the heavenly demon blood within the vessel's body.
My lord, you absolutely mustn't kill him, she said, frantic. Tonight is a full moon, and he'll undeniably be useful. There's no one more suitable than him.
She wasn't really concerned about whether Shen Qingqiu lived or died. It was just that, if she let Luo Binghe kill this weirdo in a rage, even if his body's demonic qi didn't suddenly surge and cause him to go berserk, his next step would have nothing good in store for her either. As she thought this, Sha Hualing felt that her life was rife with misfortune, and she became even more desperate, shouting herself hoarse.
Even if you don't care about him or don't care about me, think about the one who...
She threw it all out, raising her voice.
Think about the Holy Mausoleum.
Upon hearing those last two words, Luo Binghe's movements slowed. The Holy Mausoleum was a place where past generations of demon race's ruling class were laid to eternal rest. Other than the current supreme ruler, the miscellaneous remainder of the demon kind were, with no exceptions, forbidden from entering, and all violators were killed. Within the Holy Mausoleum, the generations had accumulated various funerary treasures of rare quality in enormous quantity. Talisman charms and spiritual artifacts, stuff that anyone would drool over. Rumor had it that within the Holy Mausoleum there was even a mystical artifact capable of bringing the dead back to life in defiance of the natural order. With Sha Hualing as his double agent, the original Luo Binghe had successfully climbed to the top of the demon realm and infiltrated the Holy Mausoleum. Everyone knew whose hands those treasures had ended up in. If Sha Hualing was mentioning the Holy Mausoleum now, was she reminding Luo Binghe that he still needed her for something? Whatever it was, she'd obviously found the right angle. On hearing those two words, a somber red still flickered in Luo Binghe's eyes, but Sha Hualing's body suddenly dropped a bit, and the tips of her feet could now touch the ground if she strained. You managed to remind me. Luo Binghe's fingertips languidly stroked Xingmo, soothing the restless, agitated sword, as he said in a low voice, "True, there's still the Holy Mausoleum." Sha Hualing was about to gasp for breath when she heard Luo Binghe say, "Are you threatening me?" Sha Hualing's soul almost fled her body. This subordinate wouldn't dare! Just tragic. All else aside, she was one of the two main female leads of Proud Immortal Demon Wei, who'd for years on end ranked in the top 3 of the female character popularity rankings. How had she ended up in this state? Shen Qingqiu hadn't managed to finish lamenting when it felt like someone was pulling on his front, and his entire body was abruptly hauled upward. His vision blurred, and in an instant his chest had chilled to the point of freezing. When he looked down, he saw Luo Binghe had pressed one hand against the left side of his chest. The following sensation was like someone had fired a cannon into his chest, the ammunition being pure black demonic qi. Once it entered his body, it spread like an explosion through his limbs and bones via his meridians. The system's jarringly clear, shrill notification made his head throb. Touch verification successful. Connected to the central power source. Storing power. System self-evaluation. All operations normal. Thank you for your continued patronage. Isn't this touch verification a little too advanced? The spiritual energy within Shen Qingqiu had started off as a full reservoir, but after this one brief link, more than half was sucked away. But this depleted state lasted for only an instant. The flesh body formed by the Sun Moon Dew mushroom flower seed began to generate a rapid influx of spiritual energy. This influx was then absorbed even more rapidly by Luo Binghe. Shen Qingqiu felt like a mobile power bank. Okay, in my last life maybe I ranted a little too much in the comment section. He howled internally. But honestly, I only ranted about airplane shooting towards the sky's writing quality and never the male lead, so why is Luo Binghe always picking on me? Luo Binghe made a sound of surprise and withdrew his palm. This body differed from his previous vessels. He had extracted the majority of its spiritual energy and poured an enormous amount of demonic qi into it, yet it could still rapidly and automatically replenish itself. It seemed that Xia Hualing's single-minded insistence on capturing this person and all the great trouble she'd gone through to do so had been justified. With a thump, Xia Hualing fell to the ground in a seated position. She knew that she had been correct to capture this person and that she'd now survived a great calamity and escaped death. Still terrified, she ignored how her knees were trembling and hardly collected her posture to kneel on one knee. "I don't care if you did it or not," said Luo Binghe. "Remember to never let me see him using this face." Xia Hualing hastily bowed her head.
"Understood."
Luo Binghe casually sliced open a spatial rift and stepped inside. The flippancy with which he had left as he pleased was practically infuriating, just up and dumping the two of them in the wastes, like he was altogether unconcerned with whether Shen Qingqiu went or stayed. But true enough, he had no need to be concerned, since Shen Qingqiu had drank his blood. Wherever he fled, he could never truly escape. With a flick of his fingers, Luo Binghe could appear in front of Shen Qingqiu and leave him mired in excruciating pain. "So, does this mean I've become Binghe's lackey?" Shen Qingqiu thought. Luo Binghe hadn't recognized him, so if he followed along and did his job properly, maybe his prospects would actually be pretty good. Like hell. Wasn't it just once a month? A couple of more rounds of this, he could get used to it. Currently disorientated as he was caught off guard when Xia Hualing moved to claw at his face. Shen Qingqiu blocked her with 2 fingers. "What are you doing?" Xia Hualing clenched her teeth.
"Didn't you hear? He said just now that he doesn't want to see your face."
Shen Qingqiu stared at her, then reached out and tore a piece of gauzy cloth from her body.
"What are you ripping my clothes for?"
Xia Hualing shrieked. Shen Qingqiu punched 2 holes into that cloth and covered his face with it, leaving only his eyes exposed. "My clothes are already ragged enough, so I'm borrowing yours. Is clawing faces your only solution to everything? Covering myself with a cloth does the job. Must you resort to disfigurement?" If Luo Binghe hadn't needed to use this person once a month from now on, meaning she had to guarantee his absolute safety, Xia Hualing would have wanted to hack him into pieces. Though if she thought about it more, even if Luo Binghe hated counterfeits, he probably wouldn't have liked seeing his face drenched in blood either. So Xia Hualing could only swallow her anger and yell, "Go!" No issues with that. After all, it would be the same wherever he went, so he figured he might as well take things step by step and observe. By Shen Qingqiu's calculations, after Luo Binghe completely suppressed Xingmo, he probably wouldn't need a vessel anymore. Then it'd be goodbye forever, and that day likely wasn't far off. He just had to be especially careful so Luo Binghe didn't discover that he'd pulled off a great escape using the Sun Moon June mushroom flower seed. Having adjusted to his new role ridiculously quickly, Shen Qingqiu followed Luo Binghe's lead and stepped into that rift. Xia Hualing was the last to enter, and the opening slowly sealed up behind her. The star employee of the demon race's ability to adjust her mental state wasn't too shabby either. After several deep breaths, Xia Hualing had calmed down and asked, "Your name?" The other side of the rift connected to a long corridor, its 2 walls decorated in hundreds of complicated designs, though the lighting was rather dim. Shen Qingqiu was thinking that this place looked somewhat familiar as he said absent-mindedly, "Peerless cucumber." Sha Hualing muttered,
"Peerless cucumber,"
then exploded in anger.
"Are you mocking me?"
The more Shen Qingqiu looked around, the more he felt that, even if he'd never been here before, he must have at least heard the description somewhere, and in the process, he fully ignored Sha Hualing. Having received no response, she threatened him angrily.
"No matter where you're from, now that you've drunk heavenly demon blood, you henceforth belong to the Lord. If you try to rebel, death and a desecrated corpse will be a kindness."
After turning a corner and passing several disciples wearing familiar light yellow robes, Shen Qingqiu was finally certain. This was Huanghua Palace, Luo Binghe's headquarters in the human realm. But this was far too different from the Huanghua Palace he knew. Huanghua Palace was supposed to be resplendent and majestic, dazzling with gold and jade, each plank and stone grand and lavish to the utmost. But the architecture before his eyes could only be described with one word: lifeless. Past generations of palace masters had to one adored extravagance, and Luo Binghe was no exception. It was just that his love was for extravagant darkness. Even the 2 rows of oil lamps lining the corridor seemed on the verge of flickering out. In the blink of an eye, Sha Hualing had changed into the apparel of a Huanghua Palace disciple. When deliberately suppressing her demonic qi, she looked just like any ordinary beautiful human girl. Luo Binghe passed through hall after hall like he was in a fugue before he sat down in the main palace hall. Shen Qingqiu had wanted to go for a stroll elsewhere, but Sha Hualing grabbed him.
"Where are you going? Don't wander around. Follow me."
Shen Qingqiu didn't want to clash with her, so he could only line up beside her on the side of the main hall, back perfectly straight. Immediately thereafter, some disciples entered to make their reports. Several paid their respects to the throne, reverently relaying information. At first, Shen Qingqiu listened without paying attention, but suddenly he heard a name that jabbed him like a needle. "Palace Master," a disciple said. "During the time that you were gone, that Liu Qingge came twice more. When he was unable to find you, he demolished Linghua domain." As Shen Qingqiu listened to this, his chest tightened, his gums aching slightly. If Liu Qingge had done such a thing, surely he isn't taking revenge for my sake, right? The lack of concern on Luo Binghe's face said, "Whatever, my important self has plenty of money." He replied with, "Let him demolish what he likes. Anything else?" The disciple glanced at him, wiped at his cold sweat, and spoke his next words with excessive carefulness. "One more thing. The little palace mistress wants to see you." Shen Qingqiu's first thought was that Luo Binghe was about to summon his beloved concubine to the hall with a doting expression on his face. But, to his surprise, Luo Binghe remained frosty and indifferent, as if even speaking would be too much. He warily waved his hand, implying rejection. "But," the disciple said awkwardly.
"But I'm already here."
The mere sound of this voice made Shen Qingqiu's teeth and body ache. Before he knew it, the little palace mistress had already stormily charged into the hall, her presence as forceful as spitting flames. Following alongside of her was a comely, slightly older woman in a light yellow robe. Her eyes were hazy, as if on the verge of tears. This was Qin Wanyue. Shen Qingqiu did a subtle double take, a little surprised. At this time, these 2 maidens should still have been blossoming flowers in their prime, but when he looked at them, there was a clear impression of haggardness. The little palace mistress was especially afflicted. Those 2 splotches of uneven crimson on her face were probably due to a rushed application of cosmetics. No matter how he looked at her, she had not even the slightest bit of a well-pampered mistress's radiant glee. The little palace mistress lifted her chin, looked straight at Luo Binghe.
"You've returned!"
Luo Binghe glanced at her and didn't say anything.
"Little palace mistress, let's go back,"
Qin Wanyue said quietly.
"Do you imagine I don't know who you think of day and night?"
The little palace mistress asked caustically.
"The reason you endure humiliation and remain by my side, exhaustively thinking and scheming, isn't it all to lay eyes on him again? So why are you treating now that you finally see him, acting all fragile and pitiful? Why not just try to stop me before we got here instead of only attempting to dissuade me now?"
Head lowered, Qin Wanyue dared not to speak. Her ears flushed. The little palace mistress clicked her tongue, directing it to the hall.
"Have you found Daddy?"
she asked. The old palace master has gone into traveling seclusion, Luo Binghe said. No one has seen a trace of him. This was an incredibly egregious example of a stock, insincere answer. As far as Shen Qingqiu understood it, and this went for various dramas and novels, it was widely accepted that anyone on the throne who said this line was a main culprit who had caused, quote, "not a trace," unquote, of the previous leader. The little palace mistress laughed harshly.
"That line again. Do you have to expend too much energy to even think of a new excuse for me? All right, I won't talk about Daddy. I just talk about myself. If I didn't come to find you, would you even come to see me?"
she asked shrilly. How dare you imply Luo Binghe is the kind of scoundrel who recklessly wastes resources, who tosses his women aside without sleeping with them? Don't insult his dignity as a top-shelf stallion novel male lead. Too bad Luo Binghe plainly didn't care to preserve that dignity. Several Huanghua Palace disciples appeared in the palace hall. Shen Qingqiu assumed they were going to console the little palace mistress, but in actuality, they forcibly grabbed her and dragged her off. On the way, she screamed and yelled. Qin Wanyue followed alongside her, but sometimes she shot tearful glances at Luo Binghe out the corner of her eye, as if hoping for something. Before this point, Sha Hualing had been staring straight ahead, her posture perfectly upright, but now she wrinkled her brow and followed them out, standing in the corridor to berate them. "What have you lot been doing? You were asked to keep an eye on her, and this is how you do it?"